Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. Russian strikes on the Ukrainian city of Sumy has killed 2 people according to local officials. 1 dead, multiple injured in Russian strikes on Ukraine, officials report. Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, warned that retribution is inevitable, referring to recent Ukrainian attacks on strategic bomber bases. Meanwhile, Ukrainian Chief of Staff Andriy Yermak and First Deputy Prime Minister are travelling to the US, according to a Ukrainian source. At least 27 Palestinians were killed and dozens were injured when Israeli troops opened fire near a US-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation site in Rafah, according to the Gaza health authorities and civil defense. Meanwhile, 3 Israeli soldiers were killed in a separate incident in northern Gaza. Harvard University has asked a US district court to unfreeze $2.5 billion in research funds blocked by the Trump administration, calling the move illegal and a violation of free speech. Orders have been issued since April the 14th, with arguments set for July the 21st. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz stated that a Berlin court ruling would not halt his government's migration crackdown, despite the court declaring the expulsion of 3 Somali asylum seekers as unlawful. But the court ruled Germany should have processed their claims under EU Dublin rules. Merz has acknowledged the ruling limits the government's scope, but insisted deportations would continue. South Korea is holding a snap presidential election after former President Yoon Suk-yeol was impeached over his attempt to impose failed martial law. Those polls have now closed and we are awaiting a winner. Trump's administration has asked the US Supreme Court to overturn a lower court ruling that blocked mass federal layoffs as part of his plan to downsize the federal government. The Ninth Circuit Court has also rejected Trump's appeal, calling his move an unprecedented overreach. US President Trump discussed partnering with Japan on Golden Dome missile defense project in a call with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, according to media reports. The Congressional Budget Office warns the shield could cost $831 billion over 20 years. A UN convoy on a critical food mission to Sudan's war-torn Al-Fashir came under attack overnight in North Darfur, leaving multiple casualties, according to UNICEF. The WFP and UNICEF trucks were stranded in Al-Khoma, awaiting clearance when the assault struck. Now, our top story this hour, following another round of direct peace talks with Ukraine in Istanbul that ended without a ceasefire deal, spokesman Dmitry Peskov has said that resolving the conflict is extremely complicated and warned it would be wrong to expect an immediate breakthrough. Peskov also said a proposed 3-way summit between Presidents Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump is unlikely to happen anytime soon. This comes amid continued escalations on the ground. Ukrainian President Zelensky has accused Russia of deliberately targeting civilians in a rocket strike that killed 3 people in the northeastern city of Sumy. He posted a video of the aftermath and called for tougher Western sanctions, saying the attack says everything one needs to know about Russia's so-called desire to end this war. Meanwhile, Russia claimed its forces had captured another village near the border in Ukraine's Sumy region, and its former president, Dmitry Medvedev, made it clear Moscow is not seeking compromise in the ongoing negotiations. Medvedev also appeared to threaten retaliation over Ukrainian drone attacks on Russian bomber bases, writing retribution is inevitable. Following the second round of talks, senior Ukrainian officials have arrived in Washington for high-level meetings with US officials, including members of President Trump's team, to discuss defense and economic support and push for further sanctions on Russia. Russian drones also struck multiple Ukrainian cities overnight. One person was killed in Kharkiv, 4 were hospitalized in Cherniv, and residential buildings were damaged in Odessa, where no casualties were reported. We're now joined by our guest today, Professor Dr. Veselin Popovsky, Professor and Vice Dean at Jindal Law School. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Popovsky. We've once again seen some disappointing talks in Istanbul. They said they lasted less than an hour there, the two delegations. What have you made of these talks? Did we have any hope going forward? And also these comments that Moscow has released, the Kremlin has released, about a possible trilateral meeting between the 3 big men at the table. Doesn't seem likely very soon. Professor Popovsky, what are your thoughts?
Yes, you are right. The meeting in Istanbul didn't produce much. Another exchange of prisoners of war, which is still some minimal success. Those families will receive their boys back home. But that happens always in every war. Between the worst enemy that this happens. So not much achievement in terms of ceasefire, which is the most important one. As to start peace negotiation, one needs to cease fire first, and we don't see that. Russia again and again refused to even 30 days unconditional ceasefire, and instead is talking about trilateral meeting. Very unlikely. There is no point to have that. Nothing which Donald Trump did so far suggests any even close progress in terms of reconciling the Russian and the Ukrainian positions here. In fact, Russia and Ukraine are more productive talking between themselves without Donald Trump being present. But the big news is the attack on the Russian strategic bombers. And this is huge. A third of the Russian strategic aviation was gone in few hours. This is probably something the next century, in the 22nd century, it will be studied in military manuals, how Ukraine, a small country 40 times smaller than Russia in territory, could achieve such huge military success. This high David Goliath fight, and Ukraine fully deserve all respect for that. These are military targets. Instead, what Russia can do is only target civilians, as you mentioned correctly, in Sumy and other Kharkiv and other cities.
Yes.
So what Ukraine is doing is absolutely entirely proper in international humanitarian law, military strikes. What Russia is doing daily are war crimes, and they will respond for that.
Professor Popovsky, we have spoken about Zelensky pushing for further Western sanctions on the country of Russia. Some people are speculating that Putin might be just getting into these negotiations to ease those sanctions from the United States and other Western countries. What are your thoughts on the imposition of sanctions on Russia, and do you think that Donald Trump will act, even given this public discourse which now Zelensky is posting on his social media? Do you think that Vladimir Putin really does want this peace?
He doesn't want peace, but he wants sanctions to be lifted because they are hurting the economy of Russia. The response to that is the opposite. More sanctions, harsh sanctions. Countries should stop buying Russian oil and gas, otherwise they will face secondary sanctions. I think that's the right way to go here. Strong pressure, increasing sanctions, including by the US administrations, hopefully, but also by many other countries. There are countries that are buying Russian oil and gas, and they need to reconsider what they are buying, because effectively the only way Russia can have any revenue and money to buy more weapons and more soldiers is by exporting oil and gas. Countries should find alternatives and stop buying oil and gas from Russia. It is kind of unrealistic to expect sanctions to work without those sanctions being global by all the countries in the world, including in the global south.
And finally, Dr. Popovsky, you briefly mentioned Operation Spiderweb just then, the operation which Ukraine, which they claim to have destroyed $7 billion worth of Russian military equipment. That includes aeroplanes and so on. Medvedev has warned that retribution is inevitable over these drone strikes. How serious do you think this threat is? Do you think we could be facing some serious response to these drone attacks on the country of Ukraine in the coming times?
Yes, this was really a masterpiece. As I mentioned, it will be studied in the 22nd century how Ukraine could do that, destroying a third of the Russian strategic bombers, $7 billion costing those, and they cannot produce anymore. These are out of production. How Russia will respond again? They will respond by killing civilians. They cannot do anything anymore. All Russia can do is bombing cities and killing some more civilians. So Ukraine does need extra air defense system, and that's what NATO and other countries should provide to Ukraine. I wouldn't take those threats very seriously. What Russia says is an absolute lie. They call those attacks on the airdromes as terrorist attack. They try to minimize, but we see a dead silence from Putin and a dead silence from Donald Trump, by the way. Both of them are really shocked by the masterpiece which Ukraine produced over the weekend. And hopefully there will be more such strikes by Ukraine as to reduce further the Russian aggression, which, by the way, works very well for the rest of the world too. It's a good news for everybody. Reducing Russian military force is a good news for everybody, including country in the global south.
Yes, Dr. Popovsky, thank you very much for joining us. For our next story, we move to the Middle East, where the Red Cross and Gaza Health Ministry has said at least 27 people have been killed at a new food distribution centre in southern Gaza. As per reports, Israeli soldiers opened fire near crowds of Palestinians walking towards the aid site. This was the second such shooting by Israeli forces in 3 days near the same distribution site in the southern city of Rafah, according to reports. Thousands of hungry Palestinians are coming early each day in hopes of securing a food handout. The United Nations has condemned the ongoing humanitarian crisis and the fresh attacks. UN Human Rights Chief Volker Turk has said that deadly attacks on civilians around aid distribution sites in the Gaza Strip constituted as a war crime. Meanwhile, here's what the OHCHR spokesperson had to say about the attacks.
Deadly attacks on distraught civilians trying to access the paltry amounts of food aid in Gaza are unconscionable. For a third day running, people were killed around an aid distribution site run by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This morning, we received information that dozens more people were killed and injured. There must be a prompt and impartial investigation into each of these attacks and those responsible held to account. Attacks directed against civilians constitute a grave breach of international law and a war crime.
We're now joined by Ross Finegold, political risk analyst, to discuss this in more detail. Ross, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. This is the second incident similar in the space of 3 days at this aid distribution point by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. We have constant conflicting reports, as we've had for most of this conflict, coming from Israel denying such actions, firing at civilians, and then we have the registered terrorist group Hamas, who claim otherwise. Where do you find the truth in something like this? It's obviously, we've seen the visuals of the chaos at these aid distribution sites. What are your thoughts on incidents like this?
That's the nature of distributing food in a war zone. Unfortunately, the civilians are constantly caught in the middle between the ongoing fighting between Israel and Hamas. Hamas, despite Israel's efforts, is not finished as a fighting force. And there's fighting going on in many parts of the Gaza Strip, including near where aid distribution is occurring, unfortunately. But it's not Hamas's playbook to keep a distance from aid distribution. That's simply not what they're going to do. And it helps Hamas's cause to ensure that, frankly, that there is fighting near aid distribution. It gets more international criticism of Israel if Israel opens fire near where civilians are.
Another thing, Ross, that's frequently mentioned about these aid sites is that there's only 4 currently. There is plans to open more, but concurrently they've been accused of using aid as warfare. They've been accused of forcibly displacing Palestinians to get this aid. What are your thoughts on these accusations, and also the way that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has acted so far?
Yeah, those are all very legitimate questions to ask of Israel. Israel does have obligations under international law when it occupies territory to ensure that civilians do receive aid, and the civilians should receive aid safely. But again, this is a war zone, and unfortunately there are hostilities that are ongoing. And despite whatever efforts either the Israeli military or the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation makes, the war follows where people are. And that's just the reality of this fighting ever since October of 2023. We also have to keep in mind that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is a newly formed organization. Their leader just left a few days ago, so they have a leadership transition. So like it or not, for better or for worse, clearly there are some growing pains with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as well, which is very unfortunate, but at the moment they are the only game in town. They are the only organization that's able to provide aid on the ground.
Ross, you do say that these people are getting caught up in a war zone, so this is something that's going to happen. But the accusation from coming in from inside of Gaza is that people are being shot while queuing for food. Is the aid system in Gaza no longer functioning as an aid point and more of a place of danger?
Well, certainly it's a place of danger again, though. That's because of ongoing hostilities between Hamas and the Israeli military. Of course, the Gaza government, or what's left of it, and Hamas's health ministry or spokespeople, they're going to try and make Israel out to look as bad as possible. Again, that just fits their own goals to have as much international criticism of Israel as possible. And it seems like whatever Israel does, such as trying to facilitate the distribution of aid by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, Israel's going to come in for international criticism. The best thing for civilians, and let's be absolutely clear on this, the best thing for civilians at the moment would be for Hamas to agree to the ceasefire proposal that the U.S. has made. Maybe that's not a long-term solution, and clearly Hamas wouldn't like it, but if they wanted to see aid delivered to civilians peacefully, then they should agree to the ceasefire proposal.
Ross, these visuals of shooting going on at these aid distribution sites and other such atrocity allegations have been very frequent now, and along with that has come international condemnation. What are your thoughts on powers, some world leaders now speaking out against actions of Israel, possibly threatening direct sanctions on the Israeli state? Do you think that it is warranted?
Certainly, there's a lot more international criticism from Western European countries specifically, as well as countries that have consistently criticized Israel throughout the war. But that doesn't change how Israel conducts the war, because they are at war. At the risk of simplifying the situation, they're at war with Hamas, and the Israeli military and Hamas are shooting at each other in Gaza. Sometimes the hostilities occur near civilians. So this is what makes Israel so angry, because they think the Western governments, and in recent days the Western European governments that are criticizing Israel, they're really playing into Hamas's hands, and that just angers Israel. But ultimately, no matter what criticism or even sanctions come out of Western Europe, it's unlikely to change how Israel conducts the war, even if it has prompted Israel to cooperate with organizations like the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to facilitate aid deliveries. But again, I'll just have to reiterate the point. The best solution at the moment would be for Hamas to agree to the ceasefire proposal that's on the table.
How important is Israel's credibility on the world stage? Once again, we've seen it. We've seen the opposition rising, and you say from Western Europe, and also Canada has raised their concerns. Do you see, if more opposition comes out, Israel changing their strategy to this? Or do you think Netanyahu will stand by his principles and continue Operation Gideon's Chariots, is what it's called? What are your thoughts?
It's more likely that Netanyahu digs in. They're not totally disconnected from the international criticism. Again, I think the recent international criticism prompted Israel to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation to facilitate aid deliveries. But generally speaking, Netanyahu and the coalition of very conservative, or some people call them right-wing, political parties that make up this government, they're not going to change how they conduct the war. So for a dramatic change in Israeli policy, there would have to be a change in government, which at the moment looks very unlikely.
Ross Finegold, thank you very much for joining us. We have some breaking news coming in now, where Russia has temporarily suspended civil maritime traffic in waters off Sevastopol in Crimea. This comes after Ukraine said it struck the bridge connecting Russia to Crimea with underwater explosives. And we will continue to bring you all breaking news in regard to that situation. We move to the United States for our next story, where it is set to become a battleground of narratives between India and Pakistan, as both countries send delegations to Washington, D.C. on the very same day. India's Member of Parliament, Shashi Tharoor, leads India's all-party delegation, while Bilawal Bhutto Zardari leads the Pakistani team. Tharoor, who has been at the forefront of India's diplomatic push following Operation Sindoor, said the presence of both delegations in Washington could raise interest, with the US having the chance to hear both sides simultaneously. He also expressed confidence that India's message against terrorism will resonate despite the challenging media environment. Tharoor criticised Pakistan and China for blocking the naming of the terror group, the Resistance Front, in a United Nations Security Council statement. He also denied US President Donald Trump's claim of mediating a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. Let's listen in to what the Indian leader said.
In Washington, we'll have the interesting phenomenon of the Pakistani delegation in America on almost exactly the same dates. They've been in New York, I believe, today and tomorrow they'll be in New York. Thereafter, yesterday and today, I beg your pardon, in New York. Tomorrow onwards, they will be in Washington while we are in Washington on the same dates. So there's going to be some, perhaps, increase in interest because of the fact there are two dueling delegations, as it were, in the same city.
The Indian delegation will meet key officials and experts to push India's position, while Pakistan focuses on select strategic capitals like Washington, Brussels and London. We're now joined by Ambassador Suresh Goel, who's a former diplomat, and he's located in the Indian capital of New Delhi. Ambassador Goel, thank you very much for joining us on the programme. With both delegations in the American capital at the same time, is the US being forced to pick a side here, do you think?
From what I know, in terms of the dates being the same, when the Pakistani delegation is going to be in Washington along with the Indian delegation, it cannot be a coincidence. Because when Washington cleared the dates for the visit of the Pakistani delegation, they knew very well the dates on which the Indian delegation would be there. And therefore, I suspect that it was actually by design or by American design that both the delegations happened to be in Washington on the same day. And my suspicion is that by doing so, the Americans' leadership particularly, they really wanted to put one against the other or one in proximity with the others to really see the fun. I'm using fun in a very casual manner, but that's all I can think of really, because it does not really serve the purpose of the serious dialogue that Indian delegation would want to have with the American counterparts.
Yes, and Ambassador Gul, Tharor has criticised Pakistan and China for blocking the naming of the resistance front at the United Nations. How significant is this as a diplomatic dispute?
Important and rather disheartening, but nothing with which we can't deal or which is going to make a substantive difference to what we are doing in terms of building the kind of a narrative of the war against terrorism that India is fighting. We will continue to fight with that. We will continue to seek international support in this fight. But if they support, good. If they don't support, it continues to be our battle. One thing, Thomas, that I want to add, and maybe it is not really part of your own questions, but the thing is that I've been dealing with this issue in international fora for more than 40 years during my active diplomatic career. And there is a kind of a fatigue factor when the international community say India versus Pakistan, and they begin to look at India in terms of what Pakistan is saying and at Pakistan in terms of what India is saying, and somewhere a kind of uninterest, I'm not saying disinterest, but uninterest or non-interest develops, where they say it's more of the same really. I think now India has come in the position as an economic power, as an economic entity, as an important political entity, G20, G7, developed the fourth largest economy and so on and so forth. I think the world has to begin to look at India not just as a counterweight to Pakistan, or counter to Pakistan, but as an economic entity, partnership with which is in their interest.
Ambassador Gul, I want to finish on this question. We all remember that day when I don't know about you, but the news flash comes on my phone and I see it, and it's Donald Trump announces the ceasefire between India and Pakistan. A lot of the world still believes that Donald Trump is the man responsible for the ceasefire between the two countries. What's the real story here?
I don't know. I really don't know. And do you think that even if I knew, I would talk about the real story on a television in this manner when the government is denying it? No, I don't really know. But that is not either important. The important thing is that the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, which originated because of Pahalgam attack, is a matter between the two countries. They will have to resolve it. If another country comes to mediate, maybe a short-term kind of a feature will come, they will persuade, but it is not a solution to what Pakistan is doing. Till we find that Pakistan actually stops building that international network of terrorists. And USA knows it. Where was Osama bin Laden? They picked him up from Abbottabad. So come on, I mean, they should know what Pakistan is all about before telling us that Pakistan is a different country. No, it's not.
Yes. Ambassador Suresh Gul, thank you very much. Always a pleasure having you on the programme. Well, that's all we have time for, and we will continue to bring you more international news updates.